Everyone, good evening and welcome to the third session in our ongoing series on philosophy of science. Glad to see that we already have quite a few participants and hopefully we'll be joined by more shortly. Our speaker today is Jacob Stegenga, who is at the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Cambridge. Jacob is also more importantly to me, probably less importantly to the rest of you, a good friend, and I'm very grateful that he's joining us here today. His work is part of a kind of new breed of philosophy of science, which focuses on kind of relatively neglected areas of the philosophy of science. He's written quite a bit on the philosophy of medicine, including a book entitled Medical Nihilism, and also a textbook, an introductory book on the philosophy of medicine. He's currently working on a book on theories of sexual desire. And so these are areas that not many philosophers of science unfortunately work on, but they're important areas. So Jacob is someone who's really staking out new terrain, I think, for philosophy of science. And I'm sure we'll all see some of that in his talk today, which is entitled Bayesian Mechanista. We'll start the talk shortly. Just a brief reminder, so the talk will go for between 45 minutes to an hour. After that, we'll open the floor to questions. With that said, Jacob, please take over. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much, Tarun. Am I coming through okay? Great, okay. And you'll load the slides up, is that right, Tarun? Okay, super. So thanks very much for that nice introduction. As Tarun mentioned, we went to graduate school together. We've been friends for a long time. I'm really honored to be getting this invitation from Tarun because Tarun had a big impact on my own education. So I'm grateful for this now. So much of an impact that a lot of the kind of content of this sort of argument that I'm going to give today is in some sense due to conversations that go back 10 or 15 years with Tarun. I've never been to India, so when I got this invitation to give a talk, I was really excited. Like maybe this meant I could come visit India for the first time, but I guess that will have to wait for another invitation. Okay, so I don't have the slides up on my screen, Tarun. Are you ready to load that up?
The slides are up on the... Are the slides visible to everyone?
Oh, I see. Yeah. Okay. I just had to scroll through here. Yeah. So I'm going to start with slide 2. The question that I'm asking in this talk is, what kinds of evidence are required to justify causal inferences, and in particular in applied domains like medicine and social policy? Questions like, will this drug do blah, blah, blah? If I take this pill, will it lower my blood pressure? Or if we give school children free lunches, will that improve their school performance? So these kinds of applied causal questions in policy-oriented domains. So what kinds of evidence are required to justify causal inferences like that? And in the literature, there broadly have been 2 kinds of answers. Probably what's the dominant view, the mainstream view, is that to justify causal questions like this, we need statistical evidence from population level studies like randomized control trials or meta-analyses. So these are studies that test out the causal intervention in a population and analyze the data using statistical methods. The status quo view in evidence-based medicine and evidence-based policy is that it's methods like that, the randomized, which are necessary and sufficient to justify these kinds of causal inferences. Another kind of evidence that is often available for these kinds of causal questions is what I'm calling mechanistic evidence. So this is basically evidence about the causal chain that links an intervention to an outcome. So if taking this drug is supposed to lower my blood pressure, then the relevant mechanistic evidence is knowledge about the pathophysiology of my blood pressure and how that intervention modulates that pathophysiology. So they're broadly construed two different kinds of evidence that are available for these sorts of interventions. And correspondingly, there are two kind of schools of thought about answering this question: what kinds of evidence are required to justify causal inference? The first school I'm just calling Statisticalistas. So Statisticalistas are those people who say that statistical evidence from randomized control trials and meta-analyses are enough to justify causal inference. Mechanistas, on the other hand, say, no, statistical evidence is important, but we also need mechanistic evidence. So typically mechanistas say that two kinds of evidence are necessary: causal questions, statistical and mechanistic. Okay, so these two schools of thought, these two camps, are opposed to each other, and they're both making what we can consider to be like local causal local causal principles. They're articulating causal principles like, if you want to make such causal inference in such and such kind of domain, you need to use such and such kind of evidence. So they're local in that sense. And the guiding insight of this talk is that we can assess those local principles by appealing to a more general and prescriptive theory of scientific inference. So the best theory of scientific inference on offer today in philosophy of science is Bayesianism. And so I'm going to appeal to Bayesianism to try to referee this debate between statisticalistas and mechanistas. This approach allows us to explain the arguments on both sides and offer some vindication for a kind of modest mechanista position. So very broadly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to articulate two central arguments for the statisticalistas and two central arguments for the mechanistas, and then use this Bayesian theory of inference to show the conditions under which those various arguments are in fact persuasive. Okay, yeah, next slide. So just very quickly, I'm going to give a kind of visual depiction of what these two different camps are saying. So the statisticalista says, we should just worry about this like relationship between intervention and outcome and not worry about all the stuff in the middle, not worry about all the causal details in the middle. So consider the causal details. So we're just going to design our studies such that we administer an intervention and then measure the extent to which some outcome occurs using our statistical tools. We won't be distracted or excessively motivated by concerns with details in the black box. We just leave the causal and mechanistic knowledge in the black box. On the other hand, this next slide, this is just an illustration. These details don't matter. I'm not going to get into any of these like particular scientific questions here. This is like a biochemical pathway that, you know, if you've ever cracked open a biochemistry textbook, you've seen these kinds of depictions of mechanisms. The mechanista says, rather than just black box the causal details between intervention and outcome, we really ought to unpack that black box and trace out causal details to the extent that we're able to. And so this kind of visual depiction is an example of that sort of unpacking. The dominant view in evidence-based medicine and evidence-based policy is this statisticalista view. It's this black box view. So in evidence-based medicine, there's this depiction of what they call evidence hierarchies, what's on the screen now. So an evidence hierarchy is like a rank ordering of the importance of different kinds of evidence from best to worst, from most putatively most reliable to putatively less reliable. So on the top, we have randomized trials. These are, you know, big population level statistical trials. In the middle is another kind of statistical trial, observational studies. And somewhere at the bottom of these evidence hierarchies are things like judgments by particular experts or mechanistic reasoning. So this is like a visual depiction of the status quo evidence-based medicine view, which is a statisticalista view. Okay, so very broadly, we've got this one key question. What kinds of evidence do we need to justify causal inferences? There are on the table two possible kinds of evidence, statistical and Mechanista, and there are two schools of thought, the Statisticalistas and the Mechanistas. Really briefly, let's just take a look at like who these people are in these different schools. So on the Statisticalista side, we have some philosophers. So Jeremy Howick and Alex Broadbent are prominent philosophers of medicine who have been defending the Statisticalista view. On the Mechanista side, some philosophers include people like Nancy Cartwright and Russo and Williamson. In fact, there's now a kind of thesis called the Russo-Williamson thesis, which is basically just the Mechanista position. It just says, when you want to make causal claims like this, not only do we need evidence from randomized trials, but we also need mechanistic evidence. So the so-called Russo and Williamson thesis is just exactly an articulation of the Mechanista position. Some scientific methodologists have also articulated these positions. So I've already mentioned that evidence-based medicine is like thoroughly committed to a Statisticalista position. Another set of methodological criteria is associated with this famous epidemiologist, Sir Bradford Hill. Hill articulated a set of like, criteria that one can appeal to when making a causal inference. And some of those criteria included reference to background causal knowledge and theoretical knowledge. Regulators also have stakes in this question. So at least in the North American and European context, to get a new drug approved by, say, the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, it's necessary and sufficient to have evidence from randomized control trials. So if you have a positive randomized control trial showing that some drug does blah, 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 you can have that drug approved. So implicitly or explicitly, the FDA is committed to a Statisticalista position. On the other hand, IARC, it's the International Agency for Research on Cancer. IARC produces guidance on what kinds of chemicals cause cancer. IARC routinely appeals to evidence which goes beyond just randomized trials, but also appeals to scientific work from labs, basic work on physiology, so animal research. So IARC is committed to a Mechanista position. Okay, in the next few minutes, what I'm going to do is I'm going to describe what I take to be the four key arguments at play. 2 arguments for the Statisticalista and 2 arguments for the Mechanista. I'm going to describe them with some historical anecdotes, examples, and then I'll become a little bit more sort of analytic about these arguments as the talk proceeds. Okay, so we've got a lemon on the screen. The first argument for the Statisticalista, I'm just calling the evidence-based argument. So the evidence-based argument basically just says, if you want to know if some intervention does blah, 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 then what you should do is simply appeal to the best evidence that you have available. And if you're not appealing to that evidence, then you're not being a good empiricist. So a kind of go-to example in the literature on this is the example of James Lind. So Lind was a physician working with the British Navy. And at the time, in the middle of the 18th century, we didn't know what the cause of scurvy was or how to effectively treat scurvy. So Lind performed a trial testing different interventions for scurvy. So he had a bunch of sailors with scurvy. He gave some of the sailors like seawater, some of the sailors vinegar, and some of the sailors citrus juice, lime and lemon juice. Those sailors that got the lemon juice got better, and those sailors that got the other things like vinegar or tar, they didn't get better. And so Lind made the inference that citrus juice was an effective treatment for scurvy. Now that's important because, as we know now, scurvy is caused by a deficiency of vitamins, but there wasn't even a theory of vitamins at the time that Lind did this experiment. So there was no way in which a compelling pathophysiological rationale for this intervention could have been formulated. So in other words, there couldn't have been any useful mechanistic knowledge for this intervention. All Lind had was this population level knowledge that he had developed. And so the idea is, at the time, if we wanted an effective intervention for scurvy, then all we needed to do was appeal to evidence, this kind of statistical evidence. We certainly didn't need mechanistic evidence, and mechanistic evidence for scurvy was a long ways down the line in the future. Okay, so this is the, I'll just wrap up that little argument there. This is the evidence-based argument for the Statisticalista. So the evidence-based argument says, if you want to know if some intervention does blah, 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 then just appeal to the best evidence that you have, and that's very population level evidence. And if you don't do that, then you're not being a good empiricist. I gave you this example from Lind, but there are many more, say, contemporary examples. So for example, if we want to know if antidepressants are effective for treating depression, then we might as well just appeal to the very best and biggest trials that have tested this question. So suppose the latest meta-analysis of antidepressants shows us that antidepressants decrease depression severity by 2 points on a 50-point scale. What this evidence-based argument asks us is, when we want to make an inference about how effective antidepressants are, what should we infer? Should we infer that antidepressants are not effective at all? Should we infer that they, on average, decrease depression severity by 10 points on this 50-point scale? The evidence-based argument says, if you depart far from what the best empirical evidence suggests, then you're just not being a good empiricist. Okay, so that's the evidence-based argument for the Statisticalista. The next argument I'm calling the trouble in the box argument. So remember, the Statisticalista says, don't worry about the causal details that link intervention to outcome. And one of the reasons why the Statisticalista says this is that so often when we've attended to those kinds of causal details, we've been led astray. So attending to the mechanistic or pathophysiological knowledge, the putative pathophysiological knowledge is unreliable because it has so often led us astray. Here's a kind of punchy example from the history of medicine. So like pathophysiological theory until very recently was based on Galenic humoral theory, which held that all diseases are constituted by some imbalance in these four like elements. So the next slide, this is just a depiction of the treatment of psychosis. So psychosis was conceived of being caused by some imbalance in the amount of blood that we had in our system. And so the intervention for psychosis was bloodletting. So this was an intervention that was putatively justified based on pathophysiological or mechanistic reasoning, and that led us astray. That's an example from history. The next example is more contemporary. This slide is a causal graph of the causal basis of depression. And this is offered to us by some of our most famous research psychiatrists. Now, on your screen, this is too small to read, so I'm just going to zoom in a little bit. So when we zoom in once and then zoom in twice, you get a feeling for how complicated the causal basis of depression is. Even the nodes in this causal graph are themselves just like wildly complicated things, like whether or not a person has ever had low social support or low self-esteem and trauma. So these are themselves like very complicated, like, you know, social and cultural phenomena. So this kind of reasoning involves appealing to the complexity of the pathophysiological basis of diseases. So this Statisticalista says, look, the causal basis of so many diseases is just radically complicated. And that means that, well, A, we're unlikely to know much about the real basis of diseases. And B, even if we did know a lot, because the causal basis is so complicated, that makes intervening on the causal nexus extremely difficult or impossible. So in other words, we should just not pay attention to those causal details, because paying attention to those causal details is astray. It's just too hard and too unreliable. Okay, so we've got now two arguments on the table for the Statisticalista. We had the evidence-based argument and the trouble in the box argument. Now I'm going to turn to the two key arguments for the Mechanista. So the first key argument for the Mechanista, I'm calling the know-how argument. And the know-how argument is really simple. It's just, if we know how some intervention does blah, 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 then we know that the intervention does blah, blah, blah. There's a joke in the literature that appeals to testing parachutes. The idea is, if we want to know if parachutes can slow our fall out of an airplane, we don't need a population level statistical trial. Like, some people get a parachute and some people don't get a parachute. And then, you know, everybody jumps out of airplanes and we test the effects of the parachute to slow our fall. The reason why we don't, I mean, of course, there are ethical reasons why we're not going to run an experiment like that. But there are also epistemological reasons why we don't need an experiment.
Oh, hi, Jacob, I can't hear you. Tarun, the video is, yeah.
Is that coming through okay?
Yeah. Thanks, Tom.
So everything's all right here? Okay. So, right, so I'm going to continue here. Thank you, Tarun. All right. So the know-how argument is basically, if we know that some intervention does blah, 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 if we know how it does blah, 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 then we know that it does blah, blah, blah. And so we design the parachute so we know how it works, and therefore we know that it's going to work. Yeah, you can put up the next slide. Thanks, Tarun. This is a more realistic example. The details here don't matter. I'll just describe it at a very, very coarse grain. So there's a class of drugs called PPAR modulators. What they do is they modulate this aspect of our genetic expression known as PPAR. Now, we have a lot of background theoretical and physiological knowledge about PPAR activation. We know that PPAR is involved in many different biochemical pathways in many different organ systems. So if we just reason at a very coarse grain, if we just say, like, suppose we articulate this hypothesis, PPAR modulators, these drugs that, you know, mess around with PPAR, those drugs are going to have a lot of side effects. So there's a really coarse-grained hypothesis. You just reason pathophysiologically and have a pretty confident, you know, assessment of that coarse-grained hypothesis. The next example is kind of a funny one. So the first two examples, am I still coming through okay? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
So yeah, super, just cut me off if you lose the audio or something. Okay, so we had the parachute example, we had the PPAR example. Both of those involved inferring that some intervention is in fact going to have some effect. This next example is the inverse of that. It's an example which shows that reasoning mechanistically can lead us to conclude that some intervention is not going to have some effect. So this is a kind of spoof study that this Professor Leibovici performed. So what Leibovici did was he ran a trial in which he took all of the patients who were in a clinic 10 years prior, I'm making up that number, but some number of years in the past, or something like 10 years, and randomly allocated some of the subjects to an intervention and some of the subjects to a control. The intervention was retroactive prayer. So he had some assistants who then prayed for the well-being of the intervention group. And then he had a look at the various health outcomes of the patients in both groups and found that the patients who had been prayed for had some, like, you know, small beneficial effects, like a shorter duration of stay in the hospital, for example. Now, this was meant to be a spoof, so it was published in a very good journal. And the idea was randomized trials aren't always, we shouldn't always rely on randomized trials when we're making inferences about causal effectiveness. So here, the idea in terms of this talk is we have some positive statistical evidence from a trial, but we're not willing to make the corresponding causal inference. I assume that most of us aren't. It would be unreasonable to infer that retroactive prayer has some beneficial health outcome. And why is that? Because we're appealing to background theoretical and mechanistic knowledge. We are saying to ourselves, there's no way that retroactive intercessory prayer can be effective. If it were effective, that would contradict a whole wide range of very well-established physical and biological theory. And so even if we see this like statistical evidence in a good journal, we ought not make the corresponding causal inference. So this is a version of the know-how argument, but it's a version of the know-how argument which concludes we ought not infer that some intervention does blah, blah, blah. Okay, so this is the first general sort of family of arguments for the Mechanista, is the know-how argument. The next argument for the Mechanista is called the trouble, I'm calling it the trouble in the data argument. So we can go to slide 8. So the trouble in the data argument goes like this. We now have a mountain of second order empirical reasons about research in medicine and social sciences, which shows us that this research is often unreliable. It's often shot through with all sorts of biases. And it's that evidence, like evidence from randomized trials and meta-analyses, which is the like core evidence for the Statisticalista. So the Mechanista says that evidence, that statistical evidence, is very often unreliable because of biases in the methodology. Now there's, we can go to the next slide. I'm not going to dwell on this argument very much. I a couple of years ago wrote a book in which this worry about biased methods in medicine was like a core feature of the book. And I assume that like most people in audiences like this are familiar with that kind of problem, the problem of biased methods in medical research and social science research. We can speak about like concrete ways in which medical research is biased in the Q&A if this is interesting for some people. So I'm just going to take it as established that that research in the medical sciences is in fact shot through with these kinds of biases. And so that allows we can go to slide 20. That allows the Mechanista to say, right, insofar as the available statistical evidence is shot through with biases, we need to rely on more than just that statistical evidence when we want to make these kinds of causal inferences. Okay, actually, and then slide 21, if we think about it, that example that I already walked us through, this retroactive prayer example, this is a case in point, right? So it's hard for us to tell exactly what was wrong with the trial, but it's at least, the example is at least sufficient to show that not all randomized trials are so reliable such that we ought to rely on them for causal inferences. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. Let's see. Okay, very briefly, I'm going to just offer a kind of nuance to this argument. This is a picture of Banting and Best. Banting and Best were these scientists in Toronto in around 1920 who discovered the pathophysiological basis of type 1 diabetes. And then they discovered that they could very effectively modulate the symptoms of type 1 diabetes by administering insulin. And their first experiments that showed that insulin was an effective treatment for type 1 diabetes were shot through with biases. They weren't blinded, they weren't controlled. The story goes like this. On day one of their discovery using the dog model, like they discovered that they could modulate insulin in their dog model. They tested out insulin on the first human. It took them a day or two to get dosing right, but as soon as they got the dosing right, they just walked across the street to a hospital in which children who had type 1 diabetes were being cared for. The treatment for type 1 diabetes at the time was starvation therapy. So children would just be sort of starved into a coma. They would live until they were around 15 years old or so, and then they would die. Banting and Best walked over to one of these diabetes wards and insulin, and then the children just sort of woke up out of their coma. So here, the methodology of their early experiments relative to contemporary evidence-based medicine was really crude. They didn't have any controls. They weren't blinded. There were no like full statistical analyses. It was a population level study, but yeah, compared to the strictures of contemporary evidence-based medicine, it was really, really shot through with biases. But the effect size of their intervention was just so large that it was a reasonable thing to conclude that this intervention was indeed effective. But that's going to become important in just a few minutes. Okay, so I'm going to sum up this sort of part of the talk. So I just gave you sort of 4 loose descriptions of these arguments, 2 on either side. We can go to slide 23. Yeah, so briefly, we've got 2 arguments for the Statisticalista and 2 arguments for the Mechanista. So we've got the evidence-based argument for the Statisticalista, the trouble in the box argument, and for the Mechanista, we've got the know-how argument and the trouble in the data argument. Notice one thing. The evidence-based argument and the trouble in the data argument are kind of the flip side of the same question, like how much should we rely on this empirical evidence from statistical trials? And the trouble in the box argument and the know-how argument are flip sides of the same question, like how reliable is it when we base causal inferences on these causal details? So this suggests that there's some truth to both sides, but both sides are maybe exaggerating the point that they want to make, and that somehow a middle position can be carved out that does justice to both sides. And that's the ambition of the remainder of the talk. So what I want to do is try to articulate the precise conditions under which these 4 arguments are compelling. There's some sway. I mean, I hope you find all 4 arguments persuasive to some degree. At least certainly I do. But they can't all be right all the time with like much degree of generality because they cut against each other. So let's proceed. The strategy for the next few minutes is as follows. I'm going to appeal to what I take to be the most fundamental and most the best justified theory of scientific inference that we have on offer today, and that's Bayesian confirmation theory. And I'm going to use that to resolve this dispute between the 2 camps. And to do that, I'm going to dive into those 4 arguments and articulate the formal conditions under which those 4 arguments are in fact persuasive. But before I do that, I'm just going to give like a 1-minute primer on this theory of statistical inference. So this theory of statistical inference is based on a very, very simple formalism, which I'll introduce to you, and I'll show you how this is meant to be a tool to describe scientific inference. So suppose we've got some hypothesis, like D does X, this drug does blah, blah, blah. If I take this drug, it'll lower my blood pressure or whatever. So we have some hypothesis, D does X, and we have some available evidence about H. I'm just going to call that E. So E is statistical evidence about H. We can represent our confidence in H by what's called a conditional probability. So this term, P of H given E, P, H, straight line E, is a conditional probability. This represents our confidence in H. It's the term that expresses the probability that H is true given E. Now, because that's a conditional probability, the next step here, you just have to take my word for it. What philosophers of science like to do is they like to say, okay, because this is a conditional probability, we can apply what's called Bayes' theorem, and we get the term on the right. So this is just a bit of math. But there's nothing fancy here, and Bayes' theorem can easily be derived. You can find 1-minute proofs of this on the internet. So just take it for granted that that is in fact a valid bit of mathematical formalism. What philosophers of science do then is they add like content to these terms to represent very core features of scientific inference. So this first term on the right-hand side, probability of E given H, is what's called the likelihood. Now, under the way I'm setting up my analysis here, this is going to represent the statistical evidence. So this is basically the extent to which some hypothesis explains the available evidence that we in fact have, the available statistical evidence that we in fact have. The next term is called the prior probability of the hypothesis, P of H. This term represents our background knowledge, the knowledge that we had about H prior to getting our statistical evidence. And a big part of that, I'm going to argue, involves mechanistic and theoretical evidence. The third term is called the expectancy of the evidence, P of E, and this represents how reliable the method was that generated that evidence, E. Okay, so this is the kind of full version of Bayes' theorem. We have 3 different terms on the right-hand side, which represent key aspects of scientific inference. And those influence what's called the posterior, the term on the left-hand side. And this is essentially the extent to which the hypothesis gets confirmed by the evidence that we in fact have. Okay, so that's our 1-minute primer on Bayesian confirmation theory. I'm going to now use that tool to analyze those 4 arguments that we saw in the first half of the talk. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So recall we've got these 4 arguments, and now we have this formal tool at our disposal. And I'm just going to go 1 argument at a time and try to make sense of these arguments. Okay, so first let's start with the evidence-based argument. Recall the evidence-based argument, I illustrated the evidence-based argument by appealing to this Lind example, this example of treating scurvy using citrus fruit. So what was compelling about this example was just how striking the evidence was. Like all the sailors who got citrus fruit got better, and none of the sailors who didn't get citrus fruit got better. So if we go to the next slide, I'm highlighting here in green the likelihood. So the likelihood here in the Lind example was really high. So if H is citrus fruit is an effective treatment for scurvy, and E is the evidence that Lind in fact got, then that term is really high. Okay, however, I'm going to call that an extremal likelihood. So if the likelihood is extremely high or extremely low, then that evidence has a big impact on our final confirmation. And that's just a feature of the math, as you can see in Bayes' theorem. Okay, so the evidence-based argument says, in cases like Lind's example, the likelihood was really high, it was extremal. But extremal likelihoods are not enough to get the evidence-based argument off the ground. And that's because of the anchoring effect of the prior. So suppose you've got some extremal likelihood, but you've got some prior which kind of brings the likelihood down. If say the likelihood is really high, but the prior is really low, then the evidence won't have much impact on your final degree of confirmation. So for example, like think back to the parachute example or the retroactive prayer example. there we had cases like one in which, like if the hypothesis is this intervention is going to have such and such effect, the parachute case is a case in which the prior is extremely high, and the retroactive prayer case is a case in which the prior is really low, then it really doesn't matter what evidence you would get in a trial. Your final degree of belief in the intervention is going to be really, really heavily anchored by your prior. Okay, so that now we ask the question, what are the conditions under which the evidence-based argument therefore applies? We have basically two conditions. One condition is when there is in fact very compelling statistical evidence and the prior is not extremal. So the prior is middling. If we have a middling prior, like how middling? Like I don't have an answer for that, but just not extreme, not approaching 0 and not approaching 1. So in the retroactive prayer case, the prior is approaching 0. In the parachute case, the prior is approaching 1. So in those cases, the evidence-based argument won't apply. But in cases when the prior is somewhere middling, like 0.3, 0.5, 0.7, then the evidence-based argument can apply. Okay, but here's a twist to this. Okay, the evidence-based argument is supposed to be an argument for the Statisticalista. But we just briefly went through this reasoning that was meant to show that one of the conditions under which the argument can apply is when the prior is middling. But how are we supposed to know when the prior is middling? Well, we're appealing to background theoretical knowledge and mechanistic knowledge. I think that's what we're doing when we're assessing the low prior of the retroactive prayer case. That's what we're doing when we're assessing the high prior of the parachute case. So we have to already be in the business of, sorry, I think I'm in a hotel and I've got somebody knocking on my door. Give me 1 second so I don't get interrupted. Okay, sorry about that. This is quarantine professor life. Okay, so to assess whether or not the evidence-based argument applies, we already have to be in the business of making a judgment about the prior. And so what was supposed to be an argument for the Statisticalista, it turns out involves doing the kind of thing that the Mechanista says we're supposed to do. Okay, next slide. Trouble in the box argument. So the trouble in the box argument is based on the fact that very often our knowledge of the relevant mechanisms is insufficient for mechanistic reasoning to reliably inform our causal inferences. So what that amounts to saying is that in typical cases, our prior should be middling. Our prior shouldn't be extremal, because extremal beliefs about priors are often unreliable. We can just go to the next slide. So the thinking there is an emphasis on the prior. In other words, this trouble in the box argument says, look, whenever we've been reasoning about the effectiveness of some intervention in the past, and we appealed to mechanistic evidence, anytime we made that appeal to mechanistic evidence to justify a very high prior, say, or a very low prior, very often we were led astray. So we shouldn't do that. We should keep our priors middling. We shouldn't let our priors be nudged to extremal values by appealing to mechanistic and theoretical reasoning. So that's the trouble in the box argument for the Statisticalista. So when is that argument sound? It would sound exactly in those situations in which it's true that mechanistic reasoning ought not nudge our priors towards extremal values. So that's not saying much. That's a strictly kind of formal requirement. In the literature, there's been very little exploration of that sort of question. One proposal on offer comes from Howick, who says here's a rule of thumb. We can reliably appeal to mechanistic evidence when our knowledge of the relevant mechanisms is not incomplete. Not incomplete. Okay, so that's one proposal. Not. But what does that mean? What is knowledge? What is a not incomplete knowledge of some mechanism? And do we ever have complete knowledge of mechanisms? That's a first start. It's a worthy first start. But taken literally, the not complete standard is probably impossible to satisfy in most cases, and it's a pretty coarse-grained standard. Recently, there's been a group in London, the so-called EBM Plus group, Evidence-Based Medicine Plus group. This group is composed of Russo and Williamson, Sensu, Russo and Williamson Thesis, plus a few of their co-authors, and they've been developing guidelines for assessing the reliability of mechanistic reasoning. So a few groups of thinkers are starting to articulate more substantive conditions under which mechanistic reasoning should nudge our priors towards extremal values. But so far there hasn't been really much said about it, and I don't have much more to say about it here, except for this like strictly formal requirement on the table now. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So the know-how argument, again, is like the first argument for the Mechanista. Know-how argument was illustrated by the parachute example, which just said, like, if we know how some intervention does blah, 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 then we know that it does blah, blah, blah. And so what's happening with that argument? We can go to the next slide. What's happening is, again, an appeal to a prior. It's an appeal to say, in some circumstances, we have good reasons to have an extremal prior. So the parachute example is an example in which, if the hypothesis is this intervention is going to slow our fall, then we ought to have a really high prior in that hypothesis, strictly on mechanistic or theoretical grounds. So, and same with the retroactive prior case. The retroactive prior case is supposed to be an illustration of an example in which we should have an extremely low prior. So given everything we know about physics and biology, it's just virtually impossible for retroactive intercessory prayer to be effective. I hope you all agree with me. You know, usually when a professor gives a talk at some university, you're invited out for drinks and dinner afterwards, and this would be like one moment where we could have like a very fun conversation over drinks, but unfortunately not this time. I'm just going to take it as given that our prior for retroactive intercessory prayer being effective is virtually zero. Maybe not totally zero because we're epistemically modest, but something close to zero. Okay, and when does this know-how argument apply? It applies exactly when we have really strong theoretical evidence for having an extremal prior. Okay, now just let me say one nuance here. One thing that's interesting about like how the research agenda gets set in medicine and the social sciences is often deemed worthy because the priors aren't extremal. So for example, like suppose a PhD student proposed working on a dissertation in which the question being asked was assessing the hypothesis that the average age of university students is greater than 2 years old. Okay, well, I mean, there's a question which has basically zero practical significance, but it also has zero intellectual significance because our priors in that hypothesis are already extremal. It's already close to 1. And so it might be the case that we can easily imagine cases in which there's a practical significance to the hypothesis, yet our priors extremely low or extremely high. So for example, the hypothesis that like Santa Claus exists. I mean, if Santa Claus really existed, that would just be profoundly important. But so there's a hypothesis in which there's a question of practical significance, but our prior on the hypothesis is so extremely low, such that pursuit of the hypothesis, like trying to test it in an empirical context, would just be deemed unworthy. Like, it would just be a waste of time. So the average age of university students being over 2 years old, there's a hypothesis in which the prior is extremely high. The Santa Claus example is an example in which the prior is really low. So this suggests that maybe one condition of pursuit worthiness in general in science, and especially in these applied domains like medicine and social policy, is that priors aren't extremal. In which case, that takes a little bit of a punch out of this know-how argument. Because the examples that I was using to really illustrate it were themselves kind of absurd examples, right? Like the retroactive prior example and the parachute example. So I think one rejoinder to this know-how argument is that in these practical domains, like medicine, it's just typically not the case that scientists are testing hypotheses with these extremal priors. Now that said, it's still the case that the priors we ought to be taking into account the priors. So the know-how argument can apply even if it's the case that the priors aren't going to be like extremal. So for example, that's the probability that, I don't know, antidepressants in fact modulate depression severity, then we ought to take into account our background knowledge about the pathophysiology of depression and how interventions modulate that pathophysiology, like to the extent that we have that knowledge. Okay, let's go to the next slide. The trouble in the data argument, and in fact, we can just go to slide 41. So again, the trouble in the data argument holds that the statistical evidence is often extremely unreliable. Can we forward to the next slide? So the trouble in the data argument is really focusing on the statistical evidence itself. So now we're not focusing on the prior, but rather on the evidence. I'm going to skip the argument for this. You're just going to have to take my word for it. I've given this argument elsewhere, including my book, but P of E, this term on the bottom, represents the degree of reliability of a method. If a method is very reliable, then P of E is very low, and that has a positive impact on confirmation because P of E is in the denominator. Conversely, if a method is very unreliable, that means that P of E is very high, and that has a negative impact on confidence. You can intuitively by asking yourself the following question. Suppose you know that some domain, like clinical research in medicine, is shot through with methodological, and then you see some report in the newspaper that says this drug does blah blah blah. We just published a randomized trial that shows that this drug does blah blah blah. And you ask yourself, what's the probability that you would see evidence like this? What's the probability that you would read such a report in the newspaper, regardless of whether or not the drug in fact does blah, 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 given everything you know about the context of medical research? Your answer is pretty high, pretty high. You know that this research is shot through with biases, so you know that positive confirming evidence is often published, even if the interventions don't in fact do blah, blah, blah. That's a kind of intuitive colloquial argument for this importance of P of E here. So the trouble in the data argument says, well, in fact, in these domains like social policy, intervention research, and medical science, the methods are in fact shot through with many biases. And so regardless of what the statistical evidence says, and remember that's represented by the likelihood, regardless of what the statistical evidence says, the fact that the methods that generated that evidence are so biased means that P of E is really high. So even if the likelihood is really high, the expectancy, P of E, is really high. And that then has a kind of watering down effect of the evidence on the final confirmation. So, so we then just ask ourselves, what in fact are the conditions under which this trouble in the data argument apply? Well, exactly in those conditions in which the available statistical evidence is in fact generated by methods with low reliability. And so the Mechanista can say, that's pretty much all of medical research today, so much of medical research today. And therefore, we ought to be appealing to like all the available evidence that we have at our disposal, including mechanistic evidence that informs the prior. Okay, I think I'm coming up on close to 1 hour here. So I will just briefly conclude. So we can skip slide, the next couple slides and go to slide 46. So we started by asking this question, what kinds of evidence are required to justify causal inference? I argue that there are at least 2 kinds of evidence that are available, statistical and Mechanista. And there are 2 corresponding schools of thought. One says only statistical evidence is necessary and sufficient for this kind of causal inference. And then the Mechanista school, which says statistical evidence might be necessary, but it's not sufficient. We also need mechanistic evidence. And what I tried to argue is that these are local principles of causal inference, and we can step back and appeal to our more general and like prescriptively warranted theory of scientific inference, namely Bayesian confirmation theory. And that can allow us to explain the key arguments on both sides and show that, well, it depends on these contextual details, those contextual details which can inform the prior, the likelihood, and the expectancy in Bayesian terms. And all of that sort of, all of that reasoning lends some support to a kind of modest Mechanista position. And I will just wrap up there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jacob, for a really nice and lucid talk and great slides as well. Okay, so I will now open up the floor for questions. Just as a reminder, please use the raise hand function in Zoom in order to ask a question. If you go to the participants window, which you should be able to access from the bottom of your screen, click on participants, you'll get a list of participants. At the bottom of that screen, of that list should be a button saying raise hand. Please use that to raise your hand, and then I'll come to you for your question. And please unmute once I come to you. Okay, Kabir has his hand raised. Please go ahead, Kabir. Unmute and ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for the talk, Professor Jacob. I just had a small question. So I was just wondering that why are the Mechanistas just restricted to just giving accounts of mechanisms? Because it seems to me that the 2 arguments that you gave, they both might apply to just general kinds of explanations also. So why don't we just enlarge the scope and just take account of all explanation? And I mean, there's nothing stopping us from taking even non-causal explanations if, I mean, some people believe in a non-causal explanation. So why not just enlarge it and take those?
Yeah. Thanks very much for this question. And so you're appealing to explanation in your question, and I think we can repackage the question in terms of causal inference. So again, the key question here is, what kinds of evidence do we need for causal inference? But the general point of your question is exactly right. The way that I described the Mechanista position, I did it really, really quickly, but I described it as the view that we ought to be attending to like the particular causal links in the chain that link intervention to outcome. And that sounds like the Mechanista is committed to saying that it's just these fine-grained causal relations that the Mechanista is supposed to appeal to. And I think what you were suggesting is, well, couldn't the Mechanista appeal to any kind of reason that we might have that provides some grounds for making this causal inference? Those that might be this fine-grained causal chain, but it might also be the say higher order causal relations. And I think that that's exactly right. There's a recent paper in this literature, I mean, published maybe in the last year. If you email me later, I can send you the reference. But this paper argues exactly that. This paper says, especially in the social sciences, but maybe this applies in medicine too, the Mechanista position ought to hold the view that the relevant mechanisms can exist at any scale. So the scale might be biochemical, but the scale also might be social. So there might be like causal facts that are macro level causal facts that are relevant to the extent to which this intervention is going to have this outcome. So I hope I interpreted your question properly.
Right, yeah, thank you. That's quite helpful. Thank you.
Okay. So the next question is from Sana. Go ahead, Sana.
Hi, Jacob. So I want to ask a question specifically related to the positive in air quotes you had given in your book, Medical Nihilism. So overall, the Bayesian master argument is that the prior probability of treatment being effective is very low. And this hints at your nihilistic conclusion that we should have low confidence in treatment effects. So you suggested that we should instead opt for gentle medicine, which is sort of a form of therapeutic conservatism. And so I wanted to ask what in your perspective would count as good evidence, especially that one could ask for good evidence for like gentle medicine too. So I think Horvick had also talked about this in his review of your book. So yeah, so of course you indirectly did mention Hill guidelines during this lecture. So I just wanted to ask you what counts as good evidence on this.
Yeah. Thanks for this question. So, so during the talk, I kind of briefly alluded to this idea that assessing the quality of mechanistic evidence has been, it hasn't gotten so much attention as opposed to assessing the quality of statistical evidence, for which there's just been a mountain of both methodological and philosophical work. Like if we just take the one topic, how good are randomized trials, for example, there's a topic for which there's like a mountain of literature, both by statisticians, methodologists, and philosophers. But if we ask the question, like, how can we assess the reliability of mechanistic evidence? There's just basically nothing, very, very little. And so I don't have much myself to add to that question, unfortunately, except for the kind of few platitudes, like insofar as we have a vindication of modest mechanism, then we definitely ought to be taking into account that kind of evidence when making these kinds of causal inferences. Now, it's a platitude, but it's not. It's a platitude with some significance, because as I noted at the start of the talk, a lot of like really important policies and regulators don't follow that platitude. And so, for example, like the FDA approval of new drugs. And so just taking the step towards taking into account more mechanistic evidence when it's available would be, I think, a step in the right direction. Another part of your question was about linking these set of issues to the notion of gentle medicine in the book. And thanks for that. Thanks for that reference to the book. I totally agree. So, yeah, gentle medicine, I use this term as a kind of like loose catch-all term, as a kind of promissory note at the end of this book, is that like fall out of medical nihilism, but none of those ideas were like developed in very much detail. But you know, one aspect of gentle medicine is having, you know, like less interventionism in a clinical setting, and another aspect of gentle medicine is maybe modulating our like intellectual property regimes. Another aspect of gentle medicine is the exploration of like different kinds of interventions, which are maybe non-pharmaceutical. But all of those are essentially speculative promises about, you know, empirical claims. And you're exactly right that insofar as those are like just empirical claims, we need more evidence about it. And I totally agree. One example that I give in the book is about drug discontinuation programs. So like insofar as gentle medicine says we should be less interventionist, well, it'd be nice to know, like, what are the most effective ways to be less interventionist? So we have this huge amount of empirical evidence that assesses what it's like to put people on new drugs. So that's the basis of a randomized trial. But we have really just like sort of anecdotal and loosely gathered evidence about what it's like to take people off drugs. There have been a few trials that try to look at drug discontinuation systematically, but really very, very little. And so I think like an entire genre of clinical research should be discontinuation programs, just as an example.
Okay, Abhishek is next in line, but he says he'll type out his question, so I'm still waiting for that. Yeah, okay, we've got it already. Okay, so Abhishek's question I'm going to read out. He says, it seems to me that in an interesting set of cases relevant for the design and appraisal of policy, appeal to mechanistic evidence will not be helpful even if priors are middling. These cases involve disputes between theories which invoke very different ontological commitments. Case in point, suppose policymakers have to compare the efficacy of an allopathic treatment with an Ayurvedic treatment. Assume for a moment, as Indian policymakers do, that Ayurveda has a legitimate theory of physiology and effective intervention recipes. The ontology and epistemology of Ayurveda cannot be translated in the idiom of modern medicine, at least not in a way that will be acceptable to both the camps. What this means is that the causal mechanism proposed by an Ayurvedic practitioner will not be acceptable to allopathic doctors, and also probably vice versa. In such cases, where the disputant subscribes to intranslatable ontological frameworks, it seems that only statistical evidence can offer a way out. Your thoughts?
Okay, yeah, this is an excellent question. Thank you so much for this question. And it raises just like many like big and hard problems. So I think one sort of simple and flat-footed way to start responding is by saying that one need not be just ontologically relativistic, right? So one can hold this mechanistic position and say, it's not merely that we're saying that the Mechanista says we ought to attend to mechanistic knowledge, but attend to like well-substantiated mechanistic knowledge, where that involves like consistency with background theory. Which background theory? The most persuasive kind of metaphysical paradigm that's on offer to us. So in some very kind of flat-footed sense, there's an easy response to this question. Namely, well, we're just going to go with mechanistic knowledge, which is consistent with the most persuasive scientific paradigm of our day. But there's a lot more that can be said about this. So, I mean, one big problem with that flat-footed position is that it can come across as kind of not just scientifically imperialistic, but in fact culturally imperialistic. And so there are all sorts of like local healthcare practices, which many people use, which are kind of substantiated, putatively substantiated by a metaphysical conception of the world, which is not mine. And it might come across as excessively imperialistic to say, right, when we're assessing mechanistic knowledge, it's got to be consistency with my metaphysical position, not yours. And so I don't want to do that. I also think that partly because of the arguments in medical nihilism, I think there's a case to be made that for some, say, like non-allopathic medical practices, the benefits might be there might be benefits on offer via placebo type effects, and the harms of these interventions might be a lot less harmful than some traditional, mainstream Western medical interventions. So the point is, even if I was committed to this kind of like metaphysical monism, if allopathic medicine must be consistent with the dominant scientific paradigm of our day, even if I'm committed to that, I don't think that means that the Mechanista thereby says, right, therefore we're not going to attend to any of the kind of mechanistic knowledge of this, say, traditional healer, and we're only going to attend to statistical evidence. Precisely because we have some both statistical reason and mechanistic reason to think that some of these kind of traditional healing practices might in fact have like placebo benefits and might be less harmful than the Western medical treatments on offer. So, and that's, there's some statistical reasoning involved in that kind of response, but there's also some mechanistic reasoning involved in that kind of response. So it's a really question. but AI. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Abhishek. Darshi, can you ask a question? You can unmute your mic.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's a question more from the outside. I'm not inside your research program. But on page 3, you claim that two views cannot both be generally correct, and therefore you appeal to a more general, prescriptive, and independently warranted theory of scientific inference, Bayesianism. So first of all, I'm not convinced that this is true. The two views cannot both be generally correct. It's probably true, but I need to see it formally, which I don't see it there. But let's forget that. And so what I suggest, like I'm saying from the outside, is this is what you've done. I have no problem with what you've done, but another way to go would be what I'm coining this, and I call it a thoroughgoing Kincadian case-by-case local contextualism. So I would say, and Harold is a friend, he may not agree with this, but I would say if we go case by case, you could come with 3 alternatives. Okay, the first one would be, in some cases, you have the Statisticalista thesis correct. Correct. Other cases, you have the Mechanistic thesis correct. And this I can't argue for right now. And there will be cases where both are correct. Okay, I think it can be argued for, you do it formally. So if we go case by case, then we need not accept that the two views cannot both be generally correct, because we're not concerned with the general correctness anyway. We're only concerned with the local, with the local case by case correctness. And now, once we have enough of these, then we may want to generalize, right? Rather than coming from the generalizing and then going case by case. So this is my main question. Later, if someone gives me a chance, I'll ask more.
Okay. Oh, you guys are very polite with your questioning, like not asking 2 at once. Where I'm from, we ask all the questions all at once. Okay, so I think there's kind of 2 core ideas to your question. There's the contextualism, and then there's both the Mechanista and the Statisticalista can be right at the same time. And I'm going to agree with the first and disagree with the second. Part of the kind of reasoning that I went through in unpacking all of the different arguments was exactly to show that, to know, for example, if the prior is middling or prior is extremal or likelihood is middling, we have to be appealing to contextual details. We have to be saying, well, do we have reasons to think that this prior is in fact middling? Well, what reasons? Reasons about this particular context. And so contextualism, I think, is exactly right here. So the reason why I think the 2 views can't be both generally true is I just take the 2 views to be disagreeing about reliance on mechanistic evidence. So what really separates the views is whether or not mechanistic evidence is either necessary for these causal inferences, or at least sometimes reliable. On the necessary claim, there really are mechanistas who say it's necessary, and there are statisticalistas who say not only is it not necessary, it's in fact unreliable, and we ought not rely on it. So they definitely agree on the necessity claim, and disagree. They definitely disagree on the necessity claim, in which case the 2 views can't be generally true. And even if the question wasn't one of necessity, but like something more kind of like practical, like should we be appealing to it when we've got it available, something kind of more down to earth. Even there, I think there's a real disagreement at hand, where the Mechanista says definitely yes, it's often reliable and it should guide our inferences, and the Statisticalista says definitely no, because it's been misleading us so often.
Okay, thanks, Dashi. And if you have another question, you can raise your hand again. I'll circle back to you after the other questions are done. Okay, so Prashanta, go ahead. You had a question. Yeah. can unmute your mic. Prashanta, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Jacob, if I may, I will give a talk, but your talk will be the paradigm of how one should present a talk. And plus the second thing is that, now I came to know more about Federica and John's view about mechanistic and all those kinds of things. So it's a very nice presentation, but I will be very impolite to you. Excuse me for that.
Okay.
So
after this many years in the discipline, I have lots of thick skin, so I'm ready.
Yes. So that you're using Bayesian framework. So I will point out two problems, and then I'll point you, and then I'll provide you an alternative framework. The first one is that any Bayesian framework presupposes the true model assumptions. So one of the model must be true. So that's a very strong assumption to assume. Second one, you are using prior. That prior is, you try to skirt the subjectivism issue, but it is inbuilt in there. Snow started with one kind of prior. I'm talking about the cholera snow person and somebody else, and Ovishik mentioned one of them. But the third thing is that philosophers use it, and excuse me, they're a little bit confused when they use that expectedness of E. That is actually the marginal probability of E. So if you calculate marginal probability of E, which is the probability of the data averaged over hypothesis being true or false. So how we get the data, that is dependent on the priors and kinds of things. So these are problems with Bayesianism. Now I'm proposing an alternative view to you. The alternative view is that you compare two models or hypotheses, you can call it, given the data. And there you don't need to commit yourself to one of the hypotheses and compare. And there you can incorporate both models, where one model could be causal model, other model could be statistical model. You are just comparing contextualism still there related to the models, so you can compare one with the other. And there you can incorporate both your things. You're talking about the mechanistic and the statistical one. So maybe I went a little fast, but probably you understood what I said. But I'm clear.
I follow, and this was not impolite at all. So I am pretty much on board with everything that you said there. And I really wish that we could have a dinner or drinks afterwards, because I would want to follow up with you and ask what kinds of, how you would go about comparing the models. Do you have in mind like the model selection framework, like that people like Elliott Sober use, or is it?
Well, we worked on the Bayesian model selection criterion, but here we are, yes. So, but there we are comparing two models or a set of models. So those ideas are coming from the investigator's background, but we are comparing where we are just seeing whether the data given auxiliaries provide model for the one hypothesis over the other. So here you are not committed. So here is one of the problem the confirmation theory holding, and excuse me, you are also have that thing that having evidence for one model over the other does not commit oneself to believing the model for which you have strong evidence.
That's right. Yeah. So I think
it's a very what do you call counterintuitive idea. Having strong evidence for one model over the other does not necessarily commit you to believing the model for which you have strong evidence.
Sure, of course. And in some sense, that's friendly to general Bayesian thinking, right? Because one reason why.
No, Bayesians, one of the model has to be true for the Bayesians, but not for the Bayesian,
Okay. Let me mention just one brief point about subjectivism. So, of course, it's like the criticism of subjective Bayesianism being subjective is standard criticism. And one standard response that the Bayesian says is, well, look, all we're doing is we're being transparent about the role of subjectivity. Other theories of scientific inference are just kind of like bury it away. They just pretend it's not there. But we're just being transparent about like the real nature of like subjectivity and scientific inference. That's one kind of standard response to this challenge. I think there's a more specific response that I can give here too. So like in some sense, this worry about subjectivity of priors amounts to saying like, well, you might have your subjective prior, I might have mine, they might disagree. And insofar as they disagree, because it's subjective Bayesianism, we don't have any grounds to kind of resolve this. So if your prior is 0.7 and mine is 0.8, then we have this unresolvable disagreement. But recall that in the talk, I was really only relying on priors, really coarse-grained claims about the priors, right? So either being extremal or being middling. So there might be background reasons that constrain whether or not one's prior ought to be extremal or middling. So the subjectivism here is, I think, extremely modest. It's not hampered by this worry that your prior might be, 0.98 and mine might be 0.99. It's not hampered by that because of the kind of coarse graining of the extremal versus middling. And well, this is a kind of another standard response that Bayesians often give to the challenge of subjectivity, is that it's not subjective in the like a crude sense, because the context might be very different. That's a kind of local version of Hume's problem. And what the Mechanista says is we can appeal to mechanistic knowledge to those kinds of extrapolative inferences. So we can have like background theoretical or mechanistic reasons that show us that the context, the kind of physical, biological context of this experiment is sustained in the target that we really want to use the drug, say. And so this is a kind of much more modest, in some sense, much more humdrum version of Hume's problem, but it's also in some sense much more practical version of Hume's problem. And it's one kind of consideration that mechanistas are appealing to.
Okay, thanks. Jyoti, you're up next. Go ahead. You can unmute your mic.
Yeah, hello, Professor Jacob. So when we apply Bayesian redux on evidence-based arguments that supports Statisticalistas, we are compelled to accept that extremal likelihood will entail an extremal posteriori. However, that is not the case. So I sort of fail to understand this bit clearly. Like even if we have extremal priors close to 1 or 0, we would have strong background knowledge. And random trials will only lend support to the trustworthiness of the conclusion. But one may say that this sort of anchors the whole case in its favor. Hence, we are going to appeal to the middling of priors. But if we do that, then therefore how are we lending the support for the mechanistic thesis?
Okay. Okay. I think I followed this question. So the idea is, right, extremal likelihoods are only going to have an impact under certain contexts, like namely when the priors aren't extremal. And so the Mechanista asks, well, how do we know if the priors are extremal or if they're middling? Well, we appeal to background knowledge and background theories. So that's the move they want to make there, is to say, we're already involved in the business of appealing to mechanistic knowledge, even when we're faced with very compelling statistical evidence. So like evidence that comes from, say, a randomized trial, a big randomized trial, the Mechanista will say, right, is this a context in which statistical evidence can in fact even just be a contender for changing our degree of belief in the hypothesis? Does that answer your question?
It does. It does. It's thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Jyoti. So Don has typed out a question. I'm going to read it out. He asks, is the kind of mechanistic evidence limited to opening the black box kind? That seems typical when making the know-how argument. However, for the trouble in the data argument, couldn't we appeal to other causal knowledge to make the causal inference instead we need? What I have in mind is the causal model type scenarios. Take a simple case with 3 variables A, B, and C. In trying to infer whether A causes B, couldn't knowing how C is causally related to A and B be necessary for inferring the causal effect of A on B? Here we don't have to open the black box between A and C or C and B.
Okay, so, okay, I think I followed, but I might need a bit more for this question. So we haven't opened the black box between some intervention and the outcome, but we have background knowledge that suggests that there's a common cause between the intervention and the outcome.
Don, do you want to clarify? Yeah.
Hi, Jacob. Yeah, that would be one scenario where you have C as the common cause, but another scenario would be C being a secondary path of causal effect between A and B. So A, C, B would also be a causal path. So in these cases, we don't know how. It's not how A causes C and C causes B. We just, thanks.
Okay, right. Yeah. So, I totally agree with the spirit of the question, of course. And it's, in some sense, it's strictly speaking true that it's not know-how, because there's not know-how between intervention and outcome. But, you know, that the know-how argument was presented really loosely, where the general idea is that knowledge of the causal details between intervention and outcome, where there might in fact be these causal modulators, like you've described, that kind of knowledge is important. And that sort of consideration is taken to be an argument exactly for the Mechanista. Now, just how persuasive that's an argument for the Mechanista is something that I'm unsettled about, actually. So because it does require something like Howick's quick principle that I mentioned during the talk, namely the knowledge of the mechanistic context being not incomplete, precisely because you might have these causal modulators that can eliminate or completely reverse the causal relation if they're operative. And if we don't know about those causal modulators, then our appeals to mechanistic evidence will be spurious. So the general existence of these kinds of causal appealing to is in some sense an argument for the Mechanista, because it says, like, look, we really should be taking into account all the mechanistic knowledge that we have at our disposal precisely because of these kinds of worries. But then the Statisticalista can turn around and say, yeah, but if you don't have a full causal knowledge of the context, then these kinds of causal modulators can lead our mechanistic reasoning astray. And that's why we should just be appealing to statistical relations.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jacob. Thanks, Don. Mr. Prakash Thanaba, do you have a question? Could you unmute your mic? Are you there, Mr. Prakash Thanaba? Your mic is muted currently. All right. We seem to have, okay, maybe he'll come back in a second. So I will take the opportunity to ask my own question. And it's a bit of a follow-up to Don's question. I think it's related at least. And the idea is that I think this, a lot of recent work on causal inference, I think kind of blurs the line between this Statisticalista and Mechanista positions. The idea that these are completely distinct positions, I think, is being questioned. And I'm thinking specifically of a lot of the causal modeling work in the kind of tradition of Gleamour, Perthes, and so on, or Pearl, that kind of tradition. And the idea there is that causal models, which are mechanisms theoretically, give us certain statistical constraints. So we could go both ways. We could use causal models to draw statistical conclusions, and under certain circumstances, we can use statistical data to narrow down, along with certain basic assumptions like the Markov assumption and so on. We can use that statistical data to narrow down what the mechanism is, right? So this idea of the statistical data only being useful for this kind of input-output black box inference doesn't seem to hold anymore if you move into that domain. And so I wonder whether this debate kind of dissolves once you start thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so one point is just terminological, and then one is about the actual substantive commitments of the two. Terminological point is just that it might be the case that the Statisticalista term is just it's not a good term, it's a misnomer, because of course when you're like actually trying to discover mechanisms, you can use statistical tools to discover the mechanism. So that's just a terminological point. The substantive point, though, I think is as follows. Like I would take that the causal graphs approach, like Sensu Glimor, to be in the mechanistic camp, where a big part of their data that they're getting from to make the inferences that they're making is observational data, right? So it's population level statistical observational data. But of course, they'll put constraints on the algorithms that are used to learn from that data by appealing to causal knowledge, like mechanistic knowledge. And so that looks like it's just the Mechanista position, right? Because the Mechanista position doesn't say we can't learn from statistical evidence. They just say, and we ought to take into account mechanistic evidence. Yeah. So is that fair?
Sure. Okay. Yeah. I'll settle for that. Okay. Mr. Prakash Thanapal, I think you're here now, so you go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. Yeah, my question is kind of similar to what Tarun raised, that I'm also concerned that there may not be a head-on comparison between the statistical and the mechanistic approaches. And even if you look at the historical aspect of, evidence-based medicine being much more recent, I mean, you can always draw a deeper prehistory, but I'm just assuming it's around 91 or so. And then is it the case that probably what you are arguing for is a kind of a revival of a mechanistic approach, rather than, because before the evidence-based medicine, what would have been the kind of way most decisions were made was using mechanisms, especially from physiology and biochemistry kind of situation. But I also want to kind of see if I can extend this discussion, because I'm actually interested in your suggestion that of describing the mechanistic approach as a condition being not incomplete knowledge. So there seems to be some kind of assumption here that the mechanistic knowledge is more certain, based on certainty, or if I could use a different term, infallible knowledge. So that doesn't come into the discussion what we've had, and so I wanted to see if we can step back and kind of search for proposals which accept that both these positions are probably positivistic and go along the infallible knowledge assumption, and look for alternatives such as those based on critical realism of what Roy Bhaskar and his work, and that is being proposed now as an alternative to RCTs, the randomized controlled trials, the realistic evaluation approach of Pawson and Tilley. Becoming more these days. So.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, thanks. There's a lot here in this question. So just very briefly about the, am I reviving the mechanistic approach or not? I mean, you're exactly right that the extent to which mechanistic reasoning has been important in medicine and the social sciences has kind of like fluctuated over time. And I mean, one of the kind of go-to lines in evidence-based medicine has been, look at the long history of medicine, and they've been appealing to this kind of unreliable pathophysiological knowledge, like Galenic humoral theory. And so if we believed there would be, the idea would be mechanistic reasoning has been around a long time, for the worse, and it's just been in the last couple of decades that statistical reasoning, via RCTs and meta-analyses has become more and more important. And so that's just kind of one point about, but no, it's not just my ambition, which is to say, right, so we need to revive the mechanistic tradition. Because it's not that I'm opposed to the strictures of evidence-based medicine. I mean, if anything, I think that the randomized control trials are like really wonderful methods, and we can learn a lot from them. And so I'm in some sense offering this kind of more modest Mechanista position, which is to say, right, we should be making inferences based on this statistical evidence and by appealing to background mechanistic and theoretical knowledge. And then, yeah, you mentioned this kind of approach by people.
The fallibility that is assumed.
Yeah. The fallibility point. I mean, this is a central argument for both sides, right? So the Statisticalistas say mechanistic reasoning has been so fallible, we ought not go with it. And the Mechanista says, oh, the statistical evidence has been so fallible, like shot through with biases. And so both sides are really raising the fallibility of the other side. And I think both sides have a lot going for them there. But insofar as both of those kind of fallibility concerns are persuasive, that again is a suggestion that, well, we ought to be appealing to lines of evidence when we can.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Philos has a question. Go ahead, Philos.
Just a clarification, especially about the one which you have about the expectancy of evidence, probability of P. And the argument is that if it's higher, the probability of E is higher, then the method is less reliable. Okay, so it's not exactly invoking the kind of a problem of fault evidence, but a kind of a general notion. That means background informations are always essential in determining the likelihood and also the. So if the background information sort of entails or give a kind of prior to independent of this hypothesis, okay, certain background information tell us that this evidence is highly probable. Okay, it does not automatically means that it's generated by an unreliable method. So that's my concern.
Okay, so very briefly, yeah, I mean, you mentioned this problem of old evidence, and in fact, I think it's relevant. So there's like a standard solution to the problem of old evidence so Gleamore raised this problem of old evidence as a challenge to Bayesianism, and in the text where he raised this problem, he also raised the solution, which he then rejected. But the solution was, so here's the problem. Got some evidence, E. You ask what's the probability of that evidence? Well, the fact that you've already got the evidence means that the probability is 1. So it's old evidence, you've already got a probability is 1. And if the probability is 1, then it can't serve to confirm your hypothesis. And Gleamore said, okay, well, one solution to this problem that he just raised is to ask the question, not what's the probability of this evidence now that you've got it, but ask counterfactually, what would have been before you got the evidence? What would be the probability that you'd get this evidence, given everything you know of the experimental setup that generated that evidence? It's kind of this counterfactual approach to the problem of old evidence. And as far as I can tell, among Bayesian philosophers of science today, this is just like the answer to the problem of old evidence. And when we start thinking about that counterfactual question, like given everything we know about the experimental setup, given all of our background assumptions that you rightly noted we should be appealing to, what's the probability that we would get evidence like blah, 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 pretending that we haven't yet gotten evidence like blah, blah, blah. And then the next step, the kind of step that I add, is well, if the evidence generating setup, like the experiment or whatever, is such that you're very likely to get evidence like blah, 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 regardless of whether or not the hypothesis is true or false, then might be because there are biasing mechanisms in the evidence generating setup, then the expectancy is high. And in these kinds of contexts, like social medicine, social policy and medicine, those biases in the methods, another way to think about this is they introduce new, like alternative hypotheses that can explain the evidence. So for example, suppose that there's some bias in the method, like, I don't know, subjects that were getting the pill, the experimental pill, somehow guessed that they were in the experimental group. And that then exacerbated the placebo effect. And so we got some positive evidence in the trial, but there was this like guessing going on for subjects in the experimental group. So now we want to explain the available evidence. Like, what explains this positive effect size? One explanation is like our hypothesis of interest, like this drug in fact had that effect. But another explanation is now on the table because of this bias, and the explanation is via the placebo effect. So the placebo effect in the subjects that got the pill was exacerbated because the subjects guessed. So that's a new alternative hypothesis. Now, I don't have time or the mental energy to kind of walk through the formal reasoning here. But if we were to work with like the full version of Bayes' theorem and expand P of E via the principle of total probability, it just follows as a matter of logic that any additional explanatory hypothesis for the evidence, like an explanatory hypothesis that say appeals to this bias, like the placebo effect, any new explanatory hypothesis will serve to increase P of E, and that thereby decreases the final confirmation. So I have a general kind of background argument presented in other work that works through this reasoning. So I hope it's persuasive. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Jacob. Darshi has another question. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm back. I actually have a lot of philosophy questions which I'll email you. There, I see some equivocation, some possible apparent fallacies and all that. But then anyway, they're not by you; they're in the literature you're presenting. Okay, so maybe except for one. So so I find the part of your paper where there's a dialectic between the two views before you get to Bayesianism. I think that's very well done and it's very clear. And so I found, maybe I didn't read it properly, there is a mismatch between when the Statisticalista people are saying that mechanism is unreliable sometimes, and when because what they mean is that because it's unreliable sometimes, so it can't be a necessary condition. And what the Mechanistas say when they're saying it is unreliable sometimes, then the statistical cannot be the sufficient condition, right? So I think if you I look at it closely, this gives an edge to the Mechanista to me. I haven't worked this out, but it seems to me to be giving an edge to them. And then you also take a modest Mechanista view to reconcile. The other problem, just as I'm on that unreliability, is this particular one on page 5 I was looking at, is that it seems to me that it is unreliable means it is unreliable at the moment. Okay, so the maybe a more reliable data would come about to produce a reliable mechanism. So it's not in principle unreliable. That's what I'm trying to say. So since and it seems to me like they would have to argue that it is in principle unreliable, because you could then just go with the explanation at the time and say we don't have a causal explanation yet because we don't, as of now, have a mechanistic reliable data. Once we get that, then we will have a combination of both, right? So we have a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. Sorry, I hope that makes sense. And just one more point about because this is your point about that example of the prayer. Okay, that I just pulled up that research also. I got it there, but it seems to me that you're rejecting that a priori is kind of making a dualistic assumption. That is that prayers are not physical. So there's a lot of work on meditation and all that, and they just create a different activity of the brain and all that. So it could be very much there. It's just a missing link is there, and it's not there in the article also.
But just to be clear, about that one particular article, is that it's retroactive.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's praying for people who were in the hospital like 10 years prior, right? So of course it might be the case.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah, I didn't look at it. Okay,
yeah. So not only would that intervention require some kind of, mental connection, but like a backward, like the retroactive causation. And just on your point about, I think there is like a temporal condition to these concerns about reliability. That's definitely the case, that you might have some, statistical evidence which is at the moment shot through with biases, but there's no reason in principle why the research community can't just like do better statistical work. And same with the mechanistic work, right? So like we hope that our available evidence and knowledge gets time. And so that might be the case with, mechanistic models of different, pathophysiological features of our diseases, and same with statistical evidence. So surely the extent to which some evidence base, either statistical or mechanistic, is reliable or unreliable is, changing over time. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, any other questions for Jacob? No other hands up at the moment. All right, then maybe before I call it to an end, I'd just like to follow up on my earlier question a little bit, since we have a few minutes remaining. I think, so here's a potential argument that a statisticalista might make, right? So when you talk about the prior, you seem to almost equate the prior with a kind of mechanistic explanation. Like whatever the prior is, it's going to be justified by some kind of mechanistic explanation. But of course, it could be justified by a statistical argument as well. You could have now maybe you could say that, well, but if it could be both, then that favors the Mechanista. But couldn't a statisticalista say, I mean, this is one possible response I'm thinking about for them, is that, look, even if you take mechanistic hypotheses, they themselves come from some kind of evidence that also had a prior. Like if you really follow the priors back in the chain of reasoning, any proper chain of reasoning is going to start with an ignorance prior and a pure statistical argument. That any mechanistic argument that doesn't emerge from statistical evidence isn't a good mechanistic argument. And so, I mean, you can say that, okay, we have mechanistic arguments as priors, but they are also dependent ultimately on statistical arguments. So maybe a sophisticated statisticalista is not making the claim that we never talk about mechanisms at all. It's just that talk about mechanisms also grounds out in statistical evidence.
Okay, I think I follow, but I want to get clear. So is your thinking that the mechanistic evidence ultimately grounds out on statistical evidence? The idea is something like ultimately mechanistic reasoning is must be ultimately based on some like person level phenomenological experience.
No, I wasn't thinking that. I was thinking that so mechanistic reasoning might be a causal chain that connects the two things for which you have theoretical evidence. But then the causal chain itself is a bunch of intermediary causal steps. All of those themselves are supported using population level data. And maybe they're not, maybe there's mechanisms there as well, but then you can break those up as well into intermediary steps which are supported using population level data, something along those lines.
Okay, I mean, it might be population level data where the population, you've just changed the scale of the population, right? So it might be like a population of cells or something like that, or population of rats. And so this gets back to a question that was raised earlier. So I think the idea is basically like, like between intervention and outcome, there might be a bunch of different causal relations at a bunch of different scales that are in fact like operative between intervention and outcome. And so that's a kind of ontological point. And then on a kind of epistemic point is that when we're learning, like in the process of learning about the causal chain between intervention and outcome, there might be like this historical context in which there's been a bunch of different research at a bunch of different scales. And some of those scales, of course, involve comparing populations of objects and using statistics on those, the research on those objects. And those objects might be people, they might be dogs, they might be cells, they might be genes, but it's still, research on populations of entities and just entities at different scales. And so again, this is like, maybe there's merely a terminological point here with just that like the kind of statisticalista, mechanista contrast is not a very good contrast, because the mechanistic evidence is clearly based on a bunch of statistical tools that are applied to populations of entities. But the point of, I mean, really the defining feature that separates the 2 points is that even if in a context in which all that kind of multiple scales of causal knowledge is present, inferences about interventions ought to be based just on one scale, namely like this, like person level, like a population of person level outcomes, like the blood pressure, my blood pressure lowering, your blood pressure lowering, analyzed in a population level study, like a randomized trial. But in general, that the kind of spirit of your question is one that motivated this recent paper by Regula and Marcioni, if anybody wants to kind of look up this line of thinking, motivating your question and a question that came previously, where the idea is it's not what separates the Mechanista and the Statisticalista is not the use of statistics. It's that when we want to test the effects of some intervention, should we be appealing to those lower level or sometimes higher level scales, multiple scales, or should we just be appealing to this like population level study at the kind of person scale?
All right. Thanks a lot, Jacob. I think we are out of time. And the questions have, again, very conveniently ended right when the time for the talk ended.
Magic.
Yeah, exactly. It seems to work out that way quite a lot. So yeah, thank you very much, Jacob, for an excellent talk and for a lovely discussion. And thank you all the participants who are still here and all the participants who have dropped out at some point or the other. But thank you all for a great discussion and for listening patiently. And I hope you'll all join us next week as well for our next talk, which is going to be by Eric Winsberg. So yeah.
Thank you very much, Tarun, for having me here. I really appreciated this discussion. It was really, yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. Goodbye, everyone. See you next